Much appreciated, Uncle Barry. Your outsiders this morning are Roger Franklin. He's editor of Quadrant Online. Professor Sarah Joseph. She's the director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash University. And Patricia Karvelas is the Victorian editor of the Australian newspaper. Welcome to you all. And there they all are before me, which is a rarity in this segment, and delightful though. Western Australia, the country's biggest by-election. The votes tallied last night. Both parties got a bit of a whack, Roger.
They did indeed. And if I was Bill Shorten at the moment, I'd be looking at the front office for the guy to be delivering the moving boxes. Cannot augur well for his future.
Do you share that sort of sense of distress for Mr. Shorten there?
Absolutely. I think it's terrible for Bill Shorten, but having said that, I don't think he should move out of his office yet. I think there's some time to go.
Well, we'd need a replacement, which is, of course,
certainly
another
hurt
issue.
his leadership significantly. I don't think it's destroyed his leadership. I think, given the ALP is now reformed the way that you elect leaders, he's protected by that new reform, which, you know, the right faction probably resisted for a long time, and yet now it's helping him. So he's certainly protected by that, but it obviously will hurt him enormously. But I think there are bigger factors than just Bill Shorten's leadership alone. I think, obviously, we all know that it was about the candidate, the lead Senate candidate, which was subjected to the kind of scrutiny you never subject Senate candidates to. So in some ways it was brilliant to watch Senate candidates of the major parties put under the spotlight, because usually in a general election, no one even knows who to lead.
I mean, we all vote above the line in the Senate, and the job gets done. But Sarah, we saw last week the revelation of Joe Bullock. Who knew before last week of even his very existence?
And who knew that he was number one on the ticket, replacing Louise Pratt? And I think, look, this could ultimately end up being quite a good thing for the Labor Party, just because it will, it really, throws the problems with the factions into light. Because, I find it incredible that this man would have been the number one on the ticket. I can understand the arguments that have been made about the ALP being a broad church and having different views, and there are, people that share his views in the ALP. We all know that, but I do think that any sort of free vote in the ALP would not have resulted in Joe Bullock being number one.
And it's not just factionalism, of course, it's the union ties, it's that entire process by which people come to stand in the Labor Party. I mean,
obviously, he heads the SDA, the Shoppies Union, one of the most strong right-wing conservative unions in the Labor Party. The same thing happened.
They punch well above their weight, you'd have to say.
Certainly do. Now, if you look at it, it's an entire reflection of what happened in South Australia, where Penny Wong was put number 2 under Farrell. Same thing. But of course, because she was, finance minister at the time, and when sort of they were subjected to scrutiny on this, it was humiliating for the Labor Party that it's, one of its, senior ministers who had such a high profile was number 2. He ended up having to fall on his sword and give her the number 1 spot. That didn't happen because Louise Pratt was not a minister, or not even a shadow minister, didn't have that kind of profile. But it's exactly the same thing, isn't it? The sort of lesbian number 2 representing the progressive vote, and then you've got the number 1 conservative. Now, my view is Joe Bullock has absolutely the right to reflect conservative Labor Party views against gay marriage. And I think there is a part of the working class vote in the Labor Party that is resistant to these social movements.
Part of that broad church.
And they are entitled to represent it. That wasn't my issue. My issue with him was that, which was everyone's issue, was this is a guy who gave a speech basically mocking his entire political party.
Wasn't that wonderful?
Now, that was the breathtaking part, wasn't it? It wasn't that he was against gay marriage.
Oh, the breathtaking part was the classic example of a gaffe, which is letting the truth slip out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's being...
So why was he taking the number 1 Senate spot, the guaranteed placement to get into the Senate, representing a political party that he appeared to hate?
You've got a thought busting to get out here, Sarah.
Oh, no, just that, just to point out, I think he also made this speech at a time when, it was anticipated that there was going to be a Senate rerun, and anyone these days should also think about the fact that their remarks will get out.
Now, Roger, you say, death for Shorten as a result of this outcome in Western Australia. 1 in 5 primary votes to the Labor Party, and that's pretty disastrous.
21%, as I
On
say.
the other side of that, we had Shorten a couple of weeks back flagging some sort of, at some point, reform to pre-selection processes to diminishing the impact of union clout within the selection processes in the Labor Party. This result probably feeds into that sense of anxiety. Shorten could alternatively make himself a bit of a hero here by pushing on with that pretty vigorously.
Do you think he's got the qualifications to be a hero, given his AWU associations?
Well, there is that.
Given that the Royal Commission is going to come up into a lot of the activities in which he was either directly or peripherally involved? Do you think, in view of the renovations that were done to 36 and Phillip Street, Abbotsford, which have never been adequately explained, all of which are going to get dragged out, but all of which Shorten knew about later, do you think he's really in a position to do this, or do you think it's just so much hollow talk?
But it's certainly necessary, isn't it, in terms of the Labor Party's future? I mean, if this result shows us anything, it's the necessity of that sort of reform.
Well, it goes back to my original point that, it could end up being, I think reform is becoming inevitable, just with the disconnect between numbers of peoples who are in unions and number of peoples who, and the general appeal of the...
12% of the private sector workforce that's in one is overly represented in the Labor Party.
Yeah, well, and the general appeal of the ALP. It wants to broaden its appeal. And I note also there was an interesting argument in Crikey this week from Guy Rundle arguing that the union should divorce from the ALP. But it's hilarious, but it's also true. I mean, it's where's... They need to absolutely distance themselves to be relevant to workers. Why should workers be wedded to a political party that often doesn't represent their interests?
So with two groups, we're completely drawn together, but for no good reason. Why would unions not do that? Why would the Labor Party not do that? I mean,
because the unions buy influence by having such a strong association with a party that is the only one that can form government. So that's why.
I'm very concerned about this. I think we're looking at enormous social problems with large numbers of unemployed public school boys with law degrees who can no longer slide their way up the greasy pole via the Trades Hall. What are we going to do with them?
They could always join the Liberal Party, rather.
Well, I
think the Liberal Party is about to launch Work for the Dole, so there's opportunities.
There are opportunities.
The other thing, of course, in the West Australian vote was, yes, there was an extraordinary vote for the Greens, but I think we've already canvassed why that might have been. It was disaffected Labor voters, one would imagine, that the Greens doubling their vote. The other thing...
I think there was also some leakage from the Liberal Party. Last night on the telecast, it was being reported a very strong Green vote in some Liberal strongholds. So I think, it probably clearly got most of its votes from disaffected Labor.
Well, it's the old, I've never loved the term, but I'm going to use it because I find it a little sexist, but the doctor's wives phenomenon, the sort of socially progressive, economically conservative part of the Liberal Party.
Turnbull Liberals.
Yeah, correct. Increasingly frustrated with the sort of direction their party takes.
And of course it's safe in Western Australia to vote for the Greens because they're not going to exercise any real power. They'll have part on the crossbench.
And look, you can't discount the popularity of Scott Ludlam and what a brilliant campaign that guy
ran. No, he did run a great campaign.
The other thing is, of course, the Palmer United one, and there we see, I think, some sort of proof of what can be done with a fair bit of money. Access to media, and you can actually... But, it's a serious thing that given the control he has over a number of seats within the new Senate, potentially.
Is it not?
He's a very serious player suddenly in Australian politics.
Party.
Ricky Muir, who has this relationship that I think, we need to ask more questions and get more answers about with the Palmer United Party, absolutely.
Now, of course, with the Western Australian vote out of the way, we're going to have, I suspect, a bit more of this kind of discussion.
We face a significant challenge in maintaining the rates of growth in living standards that Australians have come to expect. Research consistently shows that reduced reliance on income taxes and increased reliance on other more efficient sources of revenue, which can include indirect taxes, can support higher growth and higher living standards. Ultimately, the return to surplus must be underpinned by policy decisions, by individual hard decisions taken by government. This will hit lower and middle income earners. It'll have adverse labour force participation effects. There are things that we want to do, good things that we want to do as a society, things that we voted for, that are not fully funded by the taxes we'll be paying.
Pretty tough talk there last week from both the head of Treasury and the head of the Reserve Bank. Surely no coincidence, or perhaps a funny coincidence in their coincidence at the podium. But the message there pretty clear in this pre-budget season that the revenue is insufficient and our ambitions for what we might do with it are pretty extraordinary. How seriously, Sarah, are we going to have this discussion? Is this a discussion that really our politics can engage with the right sort of severity?
I think it's a discussion that needs to be had. I think we need to, we have to think about increasing revenue, not just austerity. I mean, we're being softened up for a so-called austerity budget, which is pretty common. I mean, I suspect once again it may not be, we're being softened up and it won't be as bad as we're being led to believe it is right now. But I also think that austerity policies can be very cruel. And I would say the burden of proof is with those who claim that they work, because I'm certainly not convinced. But the problem is, going back to your question, can we have this debate? Because even though I actually think the two major parties are quite close together on many policies, in terms of actual politics and personalities, it's very polarised. So it's hard to see politics coming together to make the hard decisions needed to raise revenue, which is always going to be contentious.
And revenue is going to be the thing. I mean, Roger, we can cut and we can cut and we can cut, but there's an imbalance there. I mean, tax has to be part of the discussion.
Cut. Why raise taxes when you can reduce expenditure? Off the top of my head, I could knock $3 billion off the budget straight away. Get rid of the ABC. Knock off the Australia Council. Have a really good look at the ARC grant system.
But we're looking at tens of billions of dollars.
Well,
these are serious
that's 30
issues.
seconds work. Give me a minute, I reckon I could get there.
I can see you getting that through the lower and upper house easily.
Yeah.
Look, I think we have a huge problem with the budget, structural problem with the budget. I think that the previous government and with the current government in bipartisan fashion raised expectations of what the sort of taxpayers can expect, the NDIS being a big one. I think it's a very necessary scheme, don't get me wrong, but I think it's...
But we do need to find a way to pay for it.
Of course, and I think that, I know that the Labor Party's been squealing every time that the current government's been trying to draw attention to the unsustainable nature of the way it's been constructed and the lack of limitations on it, but I think it's a real issue, and I think social spending and the way that we can keep that sustainable, given an ageing population, the welfare system more broadly, the family tax system, all of the various payments that go to people, I think, need to be looked at. Now,
there's a problem, though, isn't there, Sarah, in the disconnect between our electoral politics and the reality of the policy and political situation that governments find in office. Our electoral politics don't welcome a discussion of increasing revenue, but the circumstances demand it. How do we reconcile those things?
Well, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, it may take us back to 1999, that one party is going to bite the bullet and then the other party, one suspects, will take advantage of that. And we'll see how it plays. Because I gather that...
Someone needs to blink, the other one will jump in.
Yeah, I gather that New Zealand managed to have such a discussion, and there was sort of a bipartisan approach. But at the moment, I can't really see that happening in Australian politics.
It's particularly difficult for Tony Abbott because he's constructed, because of, learning the mistakes of Labor, this whole... I won't break any election promises. That's what we're talking about, the GST here, right? Broadening the base is one way that's obviously been suggested. There is absolute fear from the governing party of entertaining that because it goes against an election promise. Now,
and whether the Labor Party would be sufficiently cynical to take the bait and say, yeah, but that's not what you said, despite the fact that it's a sensible and obvious thing to do.
Well, the same thing of the pay parental leave scheme, that ridiculous scheme that we're all, going to have to pay for because Tony Abbott promised it twice, and now we can't look at it twice. Now, even though the mothers of Australia, including me, I've got 2 small children, are saying that's not where we need the help. I mean, not in the 6 months after. It's the 18 years of working and balancing life where people need a better system. So I think that's the problem with politics. The political system has become such a game that people are so fearful of breaking the trust with voters, which I think is, has a level of... There's something sensible about that, but by the same token, there's no risk-taking, there's no sort of big reforms.
It inhibits this kind of discussion.
Of course, there's a fear of the electoral backlash, and that's because of the sort of tit-for-tat, and you can imagine how Bill Shorten would have a field day.
But there's
entertain
another side of this, Roger, which is that I'm not sure that voters, that people like us, are actually that shy of this discussion. which means maybe there's a media role too in leading some of this.
And I think people need to be reminded that as of January the 1st until, what is it, about April, beginning of April, you're working for the government, not for yourself. And that talking about the fine-tuning of whom we take money from, where it goes to, really is a level above what it should be, which is, what does government have a moral responsibility to spend money on? What shouldn't it spend money on? And wouldn't it be lovely if we examined a flat tax seriously, which would put the government on a leash? Its programs would have to be curtailed, and we wouldn't have this debate periodically about what new taxes and what new things should we penalise and punish.
That's a whole other discussion. I mean,
surely that has to be the denominator, where the money comes from and where it gets spent. If you don't address the basics of it, and you say to yourself, well, we'll just extend it until June. You work for the government until June. At what point do you then turn around and say stop?
Well, we're going to have a lot more of this chat, I think, as we head towards May, because the facts are pretty incontrovertible. We have a problem.
Don't want to interrupt, but if you were looking at the ATO to do this, look at their record. Paul Hogan, Apple, News Limited. I mean, talking about institutional incompetence there.
Roger Franklin, their editor of Quadrant Online, teasing the Taxation Commissioner. Our other outsiders have been Professor Sarah Joseph. She's director of the Castan Centre for Human Rights Law at Monash University. And Patricia Cavalis is Victorian editor of The Australian. We will regather to do this same time next week. WA election, well, First Dog tipped it all late last year. We've searched in the vault, and he did this explainer. Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley Award-winning cartoonist, First Dog on the Moon. Clive Palmer's in Parliament, the Australian Electoral Commissioner in disarray, democracy is in tatters. 1,375 missing votes, it's a disgrace and a shambles. Remember when they lost all those votes in Indi? No, neither do I. That was before Tony was Prime Minister and we've always been at war with Oceania. I do remember laughing and laughing, but I can't quite recall why it was. Right now, out in the always sunny west where everyone's listening to Radio National huddled round a crystal set with a wire up a frangipani, hello Perth, maybe Clive Palmer is right when he says the Australian Electoral Commission is compromised, corrupt, and even on the nod on the 96 tram. Maybe he's right when he says the AEC shares a moon base with the CIA. It does seem odd that the Australian Electoral Commission's been having trouble doing the simplest thing, counting votes and then putting them in a box. You see, you don't just have to count the votes, you have to put them in the box or basket or other vote-shaped container afterward because, and this is not complicated, but pay attention, you have to hang on to them just in case you need to count them again. It's called a recount, and while it's a very technical term, I don't expect you to understand it, it's the only thing the ASC has to do, and they seem to have buggered it up. Except in Fairfax, just ask Clive. To be fair, there are millions of votes. There's supposed to be one for every Australian over 18, and the margin for error is considerable, even if they get the count right, because every Australian over 18 is allowed to vote. But what if the people of WA wanted, say, Gwendolyn Headcrab of the Australian Teeny Tiny Party to go to Canberra and give those fat cats for what for? Or did they? Perhaps they wanted that nice young Senator Follicle back in the nation's capital, the one with all those lovely shirts. Or maybe they wanted one of the other weirdos or factional hacks who were lining up to motivate the cleavage of taxpayer-funded largesse over in that giant political food trough the rest of us know as Canberra. Now, we'll never know. The AEC lost 1,375 votes. Not 2, not even 74, which is about as many West Australian Senate ballots you could shove down your dacks without giving yourself a nasty paper cut on the Scott Morrison. 1,375. They were in the middle of a recount, lost a Clive load of ballots, and then they declared it anyway. For the Greens. Now that seems a bit sus. I smell a rat. That's right. The delicious-smelling native rat, or bush rat, Rattus fuscipes, is a small Australian nocturnal omnivore. It's one of the most common species of rats and is found in many heathland areas of Victoria and New South Wales. Unlike other Rattus species, it's characterised by having a small tympanic bullae and a straight incisive foramina.
Adult bush rats are smaller than the Australian swamp rat, Rattus nutriolus, and in addition, the bush rat's foot pads are a pink colour, whereas the swamp rat's foot pads are dark brown. Adorable. And, squeak, 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 they smell fantastic. It's the only thing that gets me through having to watch democracy trampled underfoot by these idiots. Anyway, me and the rat are off to the Court of Disputed Returns, and how much fun is that going to be? Not at all. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living, proudly brought to you by the First Dog on the Moon Institute. Squeak, squeak, squeak.
Well, well, well. Greens poll was up by 6%. Up by 6%, around 15%, the best they've ever achieved in what used to be considered pure redneck Western Australia. So, yahoo yippee, the sandgropers are waking up to themselves, apparentarily. Anyway, there you go. That's the Outsiders and the First Dog, and it wasn't that editor from Quadrant Online an incorrigible Tory? What a prototype neo-fascist. What a horrible person. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.